Greetings, temporal historians. I'm your course cipher, and today we'll dive deep into the most pivotal chapter in human history, a story of three worlds colliding in ways that would reshape everything. Welcome to Realm 1, the Contact Crucible, where between 1491 and 1607, the fate of millions will be decided by chance encounters, deadly diseases, and dreams of gold. This isn't just history, this is the ultimate origin story. Every American institution, every cultural conflict, every dream of freedom, and every nightmare of oppression. It all begins here. So buckle up. We're about to witness the birth of a new world, forged in the crucible of contact. Picture this. It's 1490 and you're standing on the shores of what Europeans will one day call the New World. But there's nothing new about it to millions of people who've called this land home for thousands of years. Let me tell you about a world that was far more complex and sophisticated than any European could have imagined. Our story begins in the heart of North America, where the Mississippi River bends toward the west. Here stood Cahokia, a city that would have made Paris jealous. Picture this. Massive earthen pyramids rising from the prairie, some over 100 feet tall, surrounded by a city of 15,000 people. This wasn't just big, it was the largest city north of Mexico. The ruler of Cahokia lived atop the Great Monk's Mount, looking out over a metropolis that stretched for miles. Below him, craftsmen worked copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. This was a civilization that had mastered long-distance trade before Europeans even knew the Americas existed. By 1491, Cahokia was already a ghost town. Climate change, political upheaval, and environmental degradation had brought down this mighty civilization centuries before Columbus ever set sail. The people scattered, taking their knowledge with them, but leaving behind a mystery that archaeologists are still trying to solve. Now, transport yourself to the desert Southwest, where the ancestral Puebloans had created their own architectural wonder. At Mesa Verde, families lived in cliff dwellings that looked like apartment complexes carved into the canyon wall. These weren't crude shelters. They were sophisticated, multi-story buildings with rooms for storage, ceremony, and daily life. But the real marvel was their water management. In a land where every drop of rain was precious, they had created an intricate system of dams, reservoirs, and irrigation channels. They could grow corn in the desert, sustain large populations, and thrive for centuries. Then, around 1300 CE, they too vanished from their great city, leaving behind only empty ruins and haunting questions. Not all indigenous civilizations had collapsed. In the forests of the Northeast, something unprecedented was happening. 5 warring nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, had done something that seemed impossible. They had achieved a lasting peace. Story goes that a great peacemaker came to them with a vision. He planted a great tree of peace and buried weapons beneath its roots. The 5 nations agreed to a constitution, the Great Law of Peace, that created a confederacy based on democratic principles, women's political power, and environmental stewardship. This wasn't just a treaty, it was a revolutionary form of government that would later inspire the founders of the United States. When European colonists arrived, they found not primitive tribes, but a sophisticated confederacy that had solved the problem of creating unity while maintaining diversity, something Europeans were still struggling to achieve. Now, let's shift our perspective across the Atlantic, where a different kind of drama was unfolding. Europe in 1491 was a continent on the edge, literally and figuratively. Cut off from Asian trade routes by the Ottoman Empire, devastated by plague, and locked in constant warfare, Europeans were desperate for new opportunities. That desperation would change everything. His name was Cristoforo Colombo, though history knows him better as Christopher Columbus. He was a man possessed by an impossible dream to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Every expert told him it couldn't be done. They were right, of course, but for all the wrong reasons. Columbus had miscalculated the size of the Earth. He thought Asia was much closer than it actually was. He was wrong about almost everything, except the part about finding new lands. When he stumbled upon the Caribbean islands in October of 1492, he set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the world. But here's where our story gets interesting. Columbus wasn't just an explorer. He was a businessman, a colonizer, and a man who saw an opportunity where others only saw an ocean. His first encounter with the Taino people of the Caribbean reveals everything about what was to come. The Taino were the first indigenous people to meet Columbus, and their story is both beautiful and tragic. They had created a paradise in the Caribbean, sophisticated society of skilled farmers, master canoe builders, and accomplished traders. Their chiefs, called caciques, ruled through consensus and ceremony, not force. When Columbus arrived, the Taino welcomed him with the gifts of gold, food, and friendship. They had no concept of private property as Europeans understood it. To them, sharing was sacred. But Columbus saw something different in their generosity. He saw opportunity. In his own diary, he wrote that Taino would make fine servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. Within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, the Taino civilization was virtually extinct. Disease, warfare, and forced labor had destroyed a people who had thrived in the Caribbean for over 1,000 years. Their story is a preview of what would happen across the America, a cautionary tale of what happens when two worlds collide and one refuses to see the other as fully human. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires reads like something out of a fantasy novel, except it's terrifyingly real. Picture this. 1519, Hernan Cortez lands in Mexico with just 500 men. He's facing the Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions with a capital city larger than any in Europe, protected by thousands of seasoned warriors. By any rational calculation, Cortez should have been slaughtered. Instead, within 2 years, he had conquered the empire. How? It wasn't just superior weapons or horses, those did help. It was disease, political alliances, and a stroke of incredible luck. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma II initially welcomed Cortez, thinking he might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. Smallpox had already begun its deadly work, killing millions of indigenous people who had no immunity to European diseases. Cortez allied with the Aztecs' enemies, turning indigenous peoples against each other. And when the fighting was over, the Spanish found themselves rulers of an empire built on the bones of its former inhabitants. But the real game changer wasn't gold or conquest. It was the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the old and new worlds. Historians call it the Columbian Exchange, and it was the most significant biological event in human history. From the Americas to Europe went crops that would revolutionize world agriculture: potatoes, corn, tomatoes, peppers, and tobacco. These crops would feed population explosions in Europe and Asia and make merchants incredibly wealthy. From Europe to the Americas came horses, cattle, pigs, and wheat, but also smallpox, typhus, and plague. The diseases were devastatingly effective. In Mexico alone, the indigenous population dropped from an estimated 25 million to just 1 million within a century. Entire civilizations were wiped out, not by conquest, but by germs. This exchange created the modern world. European colonies in the Americas became the engine of global capitalism, but it came at a cost so high that we're still reckoning with it today. By 1550, Spain had become the most powerful nation on earth, and it was American gold that made it possible. But creating an empire is one thing, maintaining it's another. The Spanish faced a challenge that would define colonial America. How do you govern millions of people across vast distances, especially when many of those people have every reason to hate you? The Spanish solution was the encomienda system, and it was as brutal as it sounds. Spanish colonists were granted control over indigenous communities and their lands. In theory, the colonists were supposed to protect and Christianize the indigenous people. In practice, it was slavery with a religious veneer. Indigenous peoples were forced to work in silver mines or plantations and in Spanish households. They were forbidden to practice their own religions, speak their own languages, or to govern themselves. The lucky ones died quickly from disease or exhaustion. The unlucky ones lived to see their children forced into the same system. The Spanish crown actually tried to stop the worst abuses. Laws, like the new laws of 1542, were designed to protect indigenous people. Problem was enforcement. Spanish colonists were thousands of miles from Madrid, and they had no intention of giving up their free labor force. The gap between Spanish law and American reality would become the defining feature of colonial life. The Spanish also tried a different approach, the mission system. Spanish priests, particularly the Franciscans, established missions throughout the Southwest and California. The goal was to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and turn them into loyal Spanish subjects. The missions were total institutions. Indigenous people who entered them were expected to abandon their traditional ways of life completely. They learned Spanish, adopted European dress, and worked in mission fields and workshops. In return, they received protection, food, and salvation, at least according to the Spanish. But this protection came at a cost. Indigenous peoples at the missions lived under strict discipline. They couldn't leave without permission, couldn't practice their traditional religions, and couldn't govern themselves. Disease spread rapidly in these crowded mission quarters. Many indigenous peoples saw the missions not as salvation, but as prisons. The Spanish weren't content with conquering Mexico and Peru. They wanted more. Rumors spread of 7 cities of gold somewhere in the North American interior. These weren't just rumors to the Spanish. They were intelligence reports and demanded investigation. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led the most famous expedition, marching through the Southwest with 300 soldiers and 1,000 indigenous allies. What they found wasn't gold, but Pueblo communities that had been thriving for centuries. The Spanish were disappointed, but they had discovered something potentially more valuable: vast lands suitable for farming and ranching. These expeditions established Spanish claims to huge portions of what would become the United States. They also established a pattern that would repeat throughout American history. Explorers arriving with great expectations, finding indigenous people living complex lives, and then deciding what to do with both the land and its original inhabitants. While the Spanish were conquering empires in the south, the French were taking a very different approach in the north. The French weren't looking for gold. They were looking for something almost as valuable: beaver fur. And their relationship with indigenous people would be dramatically different from the Spanish model. The French fur trade was built on partnership, not conquest. French traders lived among indigenous communities, learned their languages, married indigenous women, and adopted indigenous ways of life. They needed indigenous peoples as partners, not subjects. The beaver was the foundation of this empire. European fashion demanded beaver fur hats, and North American beavers had the finest fur in the world. Indigenous people were expert trappers and traders who knew the continent's rivers and forests better than any European ever could. The French were smart enough to recognize this and work with it rather than against it. But this partnership came with costs. The fur trade disrupted traditional indigenous economies and power structures. Communities that had lived sustainably for centuries began overhunting to meet European demands. Wars broke out between different indigenous groups over access to the best trapping grounds, and French traders brought diseases that devastated indigenous populations, just as surely as Spanish conquest had. The key figure in French colonization was Samuel de Champlain, a man who understood that success in North America required indigenous alliances. In 1608, he founded Quebec City, but he did it by inserting himself into existing indigenous politics. Champlain allied with the Huron, the Algonquin, and the Montagnais people against their traditional enemies, the Iroquois. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was a military strategy. Champlain even joined war parties against the Iroquois, using French firearms to help his allies win decisive victories. But Champlain's alliances would have long-term consequences. By siding with some indigenous groups against the others, the French became part of the indigenous political conflicts that had been going on for centuries. They also made permanent enemies of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, which would later ally with the British against the French. The French also tried to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, but their approach was different than the Spanish. The Jesuits, or Black Robes, as the indigenous peoples called them, were willing to adapt Christianity to indigenous cultures rather than demanding total cultural transformation. Jesuit missionaries learned indigenous languages, studied indigenous beliefs, and looked for ways to connect Christian teaching with existing indigenous spiritual practices. They didn't force the indigenous people to abandon their communities or their way of life. Instead, they tried to create the indigenous Christian communities that combined elements of both traditions. The results were mixed. Some indigenous peoples embraced Christianity and became powerful allies of the French. Others saw the Jesuits as a threat to their traditional way of life and resisted conversion. The Jesuits themselves often found their efforts undermined by French traders who were more interested in profit than salvation. The English were latecomers to the colonization game, and they knew it. By the time they seriously attempted to establish colonies in North America, the Spanish had already been there for nearly a century, and the French for decades. But the English had advantages that their rivals lacked: a growing population, access to capital, and a willingness to experiment with new forms of colonization. The English first attempt at colonization was a disaster that became one of America's greatest mysteries. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what's now North Carolina. The first group of colonists lasted less than a year before giving up and returning to England. But Raleigh tried again in 1587, this time with families rather than just adventurers. The colony was led by John White, who left behind his daughter and newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English-born child in America. White returned to England for supplies, but wars with Spain delayed his return for 3 years. When White finally returned in 1590, the colony had vanished. The only clue was the word Croatan carved into a post. Colonists had either been killed, assimilated into local indigenous communities, or moved elsewhere. We still don't know what happened to them, but their disappearance was a warning about the dangers of colonization. The English learned from Roanoke's failure, and in 1607 they tried a different approach. The Virginia Company, a joint stock company, raised private capital to fund a new colony. This wasn't a government venture, it was a business investment. The investors expected profit, and they expected them quickly. The site they chose was Jamestown, a swampy island in the James River that seemed defensible, but was actually a death trap. The colonists were unprepared for the realities of colonial life. Many were gentlemen who'd never worked with their hands. They expected to find gold and get rich quickly, just like the Spanish had done in Mexico. Instead, they found disease, starvation, and conflict with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. Within 6 months, half of the colonists were dead. The survivors were saved only by the leadership of Captain John Smith, who imposed military discipline and forced everyone to work. The most famous story from early Jamestown involves Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan. According to John Smith's account, Pocahontas saved his life when her father was about to execute him. Modern historians doubt this story, but it reveals something important about English attitudes toward indigenous people. Chief Powhatan ruled a confederacy of about 30 tribes and a combined population of around 25,000 people. He was a sophisticated political leader who understood that the British posed both an opportunity and a threat. He could trade with them for valuable goods like metal tools and weapons, but he also had to prevent them from taking over his territory. Pocahontas became a bridge between the two cultures. She learned English, converted to Christianity, and married John Rolfe. Her marriage was seen as a diplomatic alliance that brought peace between the English and the Powhatan. But it was a fragile peace that would not last. The key to Jamestown's survival was a plant that indigenous peoples had been cultivating for centuries: tobacco. John Rolfe figured out how to grow a variety of tobacco that Europeans would buy, and suddenly Virginia had a cash crop that could make the colony profitable. Tobacco changed everything. It required intensive labor, which led to the importation of indentured servants and eventually enslaved Africans. It required land, which led to conflict with indigenous people, generated wealth, which attracted more colonists, and it created a plantation economy that would define the American South for centuries. The irony is that tobacco, which would make English colonists wealthy, was a gift from the very indigenous peoples that would eventually displace. It was another example of the complex exchange that characterized the contact period: indigenous knowledge and European capital combining to create something entirely new. No story of early American colonization is complete without acknowledging the African dimension. From the very beginning, Africans were part of the colonization process, not as willing participants, but as victims of one of history's greatest crimes against humanity: the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade didn't begin with America. It began with European colonies in the Caribbean and South America. The Spanish and Portuguese had tried to enslave indigenous people, but disease made it impossible. They needed workers for their sugar plantations, and they found them in Africa. West and Central Africa in the 16th century was home to sophisticated societies with complex political systems, extensive trade networks, and rich cultural traditions. The Kingdom of Congo, the Songhai Empire, and dozens of other African states were wealthy, powerful, and technologically advanced. But these societies were also engaged in warfare with each other, and warfare produced capitals. European traders didn't need to conquer African societies. They just needed to buy the prisoners of war that African rulers were willing to sell. It was a system that turned existing African conflicts into a machine for producing enslaved people. The journey from Africa to America, known as the Middle Passage, was a horror that defies description. Africans were packed into ships like cargo, chained together in spaces so small they couldn't stand up. Disease, hunger, and despair killed about 15% of the captives during the journey. But the Middle Passage was more than just a journey. It was a process of dehumanization. Africans from different cultures and societies were mixed together, making communication difficult. They were given new names, new clothes, and new identities as slaves. The goal was to break their spirits and make them accept their fate. Many Africans didn't accept it. They revolted on ships, jumped overboard, and resisted in countless ways. But the system was designed to break resistance. And for most, survival meant adapting to the impossible situation. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, just 12 years after Jamestown was founded. They may have been treated as indentured servants rather than slaves, but their legal status was ambiguous. What's clear is that they were part of the colonial community from the very beginning. These early Africans brought with them a knowledge that would prove crucial to colonial survival. They knew how to grow rice, which became a major crop in South Carolina, but they knew how to work with cattle, which became important in the southern colony. They knew how to build houses, make tools, and survive in unfamiliar environments. But they also brought something else: a determination to maintain their humanity in the face of systemic oppression. They created new forms of music, new religious practices, and new ways of building community. They preserved African traditions while adapting to American reality, and they never stopped fighting for freedom. As we near the end of our journey through the contact crucible, it's time to assess the consequences of this collision of worlds. By 1607, the Americas had been transformed beyond recognition. Indigenous populations had become devastated by disease and warfare. European powers had established competing claims to vast territories, and the foundations had been laid for a plantation economy based on enslaved labor. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that the indigenous population of the United States dropped from around 15 million in 1492 to fewer than 5 million by 1650. This wasn't just conquest. It was a demographic collapse on a scale never before seen in human history. The primary cause was disease. Smallpox, typhus, plague, and other European diseases swept through the indigenous communities like wildfire. Entire villages were wiped out. Survivors were left too weak to plant crops or care for children. Social structures that had existed for centuries collapsed in a matter of years. But disease wasn't the only factor. Warfare, forced labor, and the disruption of traditional food systems also took their toll. The Spanish encomienda system worked indigenous peoples to death. The fur trade disrupted traditional economies. And everywhere Europeans went, they brought violence and exploitation. The exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the old and new worlds created the modern global economy. American crops like potatoes and corn supported growth in Europe and Asia. European livestock transformed indigenous ways of life. And American silver flowed to Europe and Asia, financing trade and empire. But the Columbian Exchange also created new forms of inequality. Europeans became wealthy by exploiting American resources and labor. Indigenous peoples saw their land taken and their people enslaved. And Africans were forced into a system of slavery that would last for centuries. The exchange was never equal. Indigenous people gave up their lands, their lives, and their freedom. In return, they received disease, conquest, and cultural destruction. It was a trade that benefited Europe at the expense of everyone else. The patterns established during the contact crucible would shape American history for centuries to come. The Spanish established a system of racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top and indigenous peoples and Africans at the bottom. The French created alliances with indigenous people that would drag them into European conflicts. And the English established a pattern of expansion that would eventually stretch from coast to coast. These patterns created conflicts that are still being resolved today. The tensions between individual rights and collective needs, between economic development and environmental protection, between cultural diversity and national unity. All of these conflicts have their roots in the contact crucible. As we close the portal on Realm 1, remember that the contact crucible wasn't just about European exploration. It was about the creation of a new world. The Americas of 1607 were fundamentally different from the Americas of 1491. New people, new disease, new crops, new animals, new technology, and new ideas had combined to create something unprecedented in human history. The consequences of contact were profound and lasting. Indigenous civilizations that had flourished for centuries were destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. European powers established colonial empires that would last for centuries. And the foundations were laid for a global economy based on the exploitation of American resources and labor. But contact also created new possibilities. Indigenous peoples adapted European technologies and animals to their own needs. Europeans learned from indigenous knowledge and practices, and Africans, even under brutal conditions of slavery, created new forms of culture and community. The story of the contact crucible is ultimately a story about human adaptation and survival. It's about how different people respond to unprecedented challenges and opportunities. It's about how cultures change when they encounter each other. And it's about how the decisions made in moments of crisis can shape the future of generations to come. Your mission in understanding this realm is to see beyond the simple narrative of European exploration and conquest. The Contact Crucible was about the collision of three worlds: Indigenous American, European, and African, and the new world that emerged from that collision. It was messy, violent, and transformative, and it sets the stage for everything that would follow in American history. The Crucible has done its work. The new world has been forged. Now the question is, what will happen next? That's a story for another realm and another time. But remember, every step of the journey began here in the Contact Crucible, where three worlds became one. Mission complete, temporal historians. You have successfully navigated the Contact Crucible and unlocked the secrets of America's origins. The patterns you've learned here, cultural collision, environmental exchange, and the struggle for survival, will echo through every subsequent period of American history. Keep these lessons close as we prepare for our next journey into the past. The adventure is just beginning.
New Women's Shuffle Dance.
The databanks await your analysis. Proceed when ready to the next round.